Welcome to the Candid Comms podcast. If you're looking for practical and inspirational ideas to help you thrive in internal communication, you're in the right place. I'm your host, international communication consultant, trainer and mentor, Rachel Miller. Through this podcast, I'll share my experience with you so you can increase your skills, knowledge and confidence on all things internal communication related. Welcome to episode 3 of season 1 of the Candid Comms podcast. In today's episode, you and I are going to be tackling the hot topic of how to work successfully with leaders. Through this episode, I'll share what you need to know, what you need to do, and what you need to think about. Are you ready? Let's get stuck in. When you work as an internal communicator, you inevitably will work with leaders. Now, if you're just starting out, you won't probably have that much contact with them. It's much more likely to be someone more senior within your team, perhaps, or colleagues who've been in your organisation for longer. But as you become more experienced in internal communication, you will work with your leaders a lot more. Now, we rarely have consistency. Let me just bust some jargon here. When we're thinking about leaders, interpret this for your organisation. So it might be your C-suite, and your C-suite is anyone whose title who starts with a C. So maybe your CEO, Chief Executive Officer, your CFO, your Chief Financial Officer, or any other of those C titles. Or you might call them the executive team, or you might call them the SLT, senior leadership team, or ELT, executive leadership team. I know you will have your own acronyms. So for consistency, when we're talking about leaders today, interpret it in the way that makes sense for you and your organisation. Now, we often have layers of leadership in an organisation. You may have the C-suite and then you might have a layer underneath. So you might have board and then directors and then senior managers and then perhaps line managers. When we're thinking about leaders, we often lump all of those groups together. So think about what makes sense. When I say the word leaders, interpret it for what makes sense for your organisation and your culture. So when you work with leaders successfully, what that means and what we need to know is how we show up. So what is the working relationship that you have with your leaders? Whenever I'm working with clients or comms friends and talking about leadership communication, I'm really interested in how we show up as internal communicators. Because here's the thing. Internal communication is too important to be left down to one team, one department, or one person. It is everybody's responsibility. I'm going to say that again. Internal communication is too important to be left down to one team, one person, or one department. It is everybody's responsibility, and that includes your leaders. So what you need to know is how they view internal communication. What's their perception of internal comms? When I work with leaders and I ask them, how do you view internal comms? Maybe if I'm auditing an organisation, for example, I will ask them to describe their internal comms. And I'm curious to know whether they're describing internal communication, which is the overarching way a company communicates, or internal communications, the tools, tactics, channels and methodology, because there's a difference. So what we need to know is have real clarity in what we're talking about when we're working with our leaders. What is their perception of internal communication? Now, sometimes I find scenarios like when I work with comms teams and we talk about leadership communication and we talk about, the role of leaders to role model behaviour. You and I know as professional communicators that is absolute gold dust. If you have your senior leaders acting in a way which is in congruence with your values as an organisation, brilliant. So that means showing up and maybe, using phrases like there's no integrity gap between what we say and what we do. How they behave and how they act is really noteworthy and really quite remarkable. However, If they don't show up consistently, and if they don't act with their values or in congruence with the organisational values, then it makes our job a lot harder and it makes their job a lot harder. You cannot be a brilliant leader without being a brilliant communicator. This is where I think the role of internal communication is super important, because in knowing how your leaders view internal communication and asking them what their impression is, what are those answers that you're getting back? Is it channel related? Is it, when you ask them about their view on internal communication, is it clear that it's everyone's responsibility, or do they believe it's your responsibility and it's much more around channels management? And what impact does that have? So here's the second part. Here's what you need to do. When you're thinking about leadership communication and how to work successfully with leaders, you've already thought about what they know. So you've captured their feedback, captured their insight about what internal communication is, how it works, and how it shows up for them. But what you need to do is then turn that into action. Now, one of the best ways that I do this within organisations is I like to listen to employees. I like to know what the top 3 things are on the minds of my employees. And this is what I want you to do from this episode. Could you write down what the top 3 things are on the minds of your employees right now? What is important to them? What is keeping them awake at night? And then do the same for your leaders. What are the top 3 things that are keeping your leaders or senior managers, C-suite, etc., awake at night? To be an effective internal communicator, you need to know the answers to both. The reason is, through your internal communications, through your channels, if you are only ever communicating what is top of mind for leaders, but not employees, there will be a disconnect. Your employees will feel like the content isn't relevant, that you're not reflecting what's top of mind for them. I find to work successfully with leaders, I make sure my leaders know what is top of mind for my employees. I'll say that again. To work successfully with leaders, I make sure my leaders know what is top of mind for my employees. Now, arguably, it's not really our job to do that. If our leaders are connected with the organisation, if they are walking the floors and listening and being very active and being very visible, they should already know themselves. However, I find if I'm trying to work with a leader, particularly to influence or persuade them on something in particular, bringing that insight into a conversation is really helpful. Because leaders want to be tapped in. They want to understand what's important for their people, or at least they hope they do. If they're good leaders, then I hope that they have that mindset. And what an incredible privilege that is for us as internal communicators. If you show up where your leaders are and you are bringing them insight to say, this is what's top of mind for employees, or tell me what you've heard from employees. Let's swap notes. Let's discuss what's going on. And then you can take action. Then you can prioritise, because you can amplify your employees' voices. I find to build trust with leaders and to be seen as a trusted advisor, which, we love being a trusted advisor in internal comms. It's a really popular thing to say right now. People will say to me, I'm a trusted advisor. And I say, great. How do you know? How do you know when you're a trusted advisor? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What does that sound like? It's how your leaders describe you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I will be sharing with you what you need to think about in order to work successfully with your leaders. If you want to learn more about internal communication, I have a special offer for you. Because you're a listener of the Candid Comms podcast, you can save 10% off my range of online masterclasses. Simply use the code Candid Comms at the checkout to remove 10% from the listed price. I offer a range of courses, and these are your courses done at your pace. You have 12 months access from when you enrol in a course, and there's a range of options to choose from in terms of topics. See the show notes for the full information, and I hope to see you inside an online masterclass very soon. Welcome back. The final part of today's show is focused on what you need to think about to help you work successfully with your leaders. And there's two parts to this. The first part is making sure you know who your leaders are. Now that sounds really obvious. However, particularly if you're new to internal comms or new to an organisation, I encourage you to look up who your leaders are. You need to know what they look like. You need to know what their names are, because if you find yourself on a call with them or maybe seeing them in person, you need to start to build a rapport and a relationship with them. So knowing who they are is a great first step. The second thing for us to think about is your personal brand. Now, this is a whole topic in itself. Let's bust some of that jargon there. So what a personal brand is, I describe it as your reputation and promise. It's who you are and what you're known for. When you think about your role as an internal communicator and you imagine how you work with your leaders, what are you known for? What do they know you for? Is it the channels, for example? And think of you as a channel manager or a content manager. They associate you with your intranet, for example, or for doing events or in town halls. Or is it they view you as a trusted advisor? Having real clarity of your personal brand is important because you need to know what people say about you when you're not in the room. So Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, is famously quoted as saying, your personal brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. What do they say? What do your leaders in particular say about you? And I often find that people fall into one of three camps. They're either seen as the comms police, where, and you know what I mean by this, where people get their red pen out and they correct grammar, and we're really fixated on tone of voice, for example, and there's nothing wrong in that. Let me point that out. But we're known as the comms police, where we say no to things and we're quite strict. Or maybe you're seen as a trusted advisor. Maybe people know what you stand for, they know what to expect when they interact with you, and they have a really good, strong working relationship. So that's the comms police or a trusted advisor. Or the third part is, you know what? I don't know what my leaders say about me. I don't think they even know that I exist. And I find that people fall into one of those three camps. We're seen as comms police, trusted advisors, or actually we don't have an active relationship with our leaders. And I'm most worried about the third part, frankly, because we need to have an active relationship with leaders. We need to know who they are. They need to know who we are, because what unites us is our intention and focus on helping our employees to thrive. Or at least it should be. If internal comms is too important to be left down to one team, one department, or one person, there needs to have clarity in terms of who the leaders work with from an internal comms perspective. So maybe you have a business partnering relationship, for example, or maybe when you look at your leadership team, maybe if you're more than a team of one in your internal comms team, you might divide the leadership team up between you. And that's quite common, because the more focused you are on individual leaders, the better relationships you have, the better the outcomes are in terms of the content you create, the conversations you have, and therefore the benefits for your employees. Where we don't have good, strong, successful relationships with our leaders, those lines of communication break down. And I have a top tip for you to think about. Think about how you show up when you don't need anything. And what I mean by that is, very often as internal communicators, we show up because we need something. We need a quote, or we need approval, or we need someone to give their answer to a question that's come in via a survey or a response for an employee. We show up to our leaders needing something. What if you start to build relationships with your leaders where you show up when you don't need anything? You check in with them. And this is where I find knowing what the top three things are on the minds of my employees super useful. If I'm having an unscripted, if you like, conversation with a leader where maybe I bump into them or we happen to be on the same call together before anybody else, what is that conversation that you're going to have with them, where you're not saying, oh, by the way, while I've got you here, can you just do XYZ for me? Or, you're asking something of them. because I find that currency of trust is always worth building up. The time that you invest in your relationships and your successful working relationships with your leaders, where you're adding value, if you're sharing what's top of mind for employees, for example, that's super valuable for them. Then when you do need something, you've already got that currency of trust. I sometimes describe that as building up that currency in peacetime. So then when wartime happens or there's a crisis and you need to hit the ground running really fast with your leaders, they already know who you are. They already have an active relationship with you, and it makes things faster, it makes things quicker, and you get better results for your employees because you are both tapped in to what matters, and that's always your employees and doing the best thing by them. So I hope that was really helpful to help you think through how to work successfully with your leaders. I'd love to know what you think. As ever, feel free to get in touch with me. See allthingsic.com/podcast to access the show notes. And I'd love you to connect. Do find me online at allthingsic or look me up, Rachel Miller, on LinkedIn. I'd love to know your top tips. How do you work successfully with your leaders? I'd love to know. Do get in touch. As ever, remember, what happens inside is reflected outside. See you again soon.